each one of these podcasts, letting you know where your guests and hosts are coming from, because we love to know where you're coming from. So let us know, if you would, in the chat, if you're on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or Periscope or wherever the places are that you're connecting to this. We're really glad to see you and glad to have you here, and good to be seen by you and heard by you as well. We do this daily podcast, and on Thursdays we talk about issues that matter a lot to us. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Ani Zonneveld, who's the founding president of Muslims for Progressive Values. Also, I'm proud to say, a good friend of mine and a bit of a hero of mine, actually. And as we get into later, a recording artist in her own right. And in a lot of ways, what Ani is doing with Muslims for Progressive Values feels to me like very similar to some of the work that many of us are trying to do in the evangelical and white Catholic communities, which is to call people to a values-based orientation for how they live their life, how they live their faith, and even how they engage in civic life and in public life, which includes their politics. So, Ani, so good to see you. Thanks for being on with us today. Ani, I always tell people where I am and what I'm doing, whether I'm standing or sitting here in the studio. So, would you mind doing the same? I know you're in LA, but give people a little context for what it is that where it is that you're coming from.
I'm in Los Angeles, a nice, sunny, warm Los Angeles, and I'm sitting. I sit too much. That's all I can say. In front of my computer, working since 6 o'clock this morning, but happy to be here.
Well, I can see the sun shining out there, and so for those of us that don't have the luxury of a sunny Los Angeles day, it's kind of nice to see it. That somewhere the sun is shining. It's always good. Hey, Ani, we've been palling around and stirring up, John Lewis versions of Good Trouble for a few years now. Well, will you tell people all the things that you do? Because I think it's kind of fascinating. And I remember when we met a number of years back, I thought you and I are like we're like opposite twins. I'm a man in the evangelical world. You're a woman in the Muslim world. We're both had started communities and trying to run communities of faith from our own traditions that were stepping outside the bounds of what our traditions and world told us was acceptable and what our faith would look like. And then we're engaging publicly in advocacy kinds of works. And so it was so encouraging to me to hear it. And I know people are going to love to hear some of the backstory of how you started Muslims for Progressive Values, what you're doing. And then we'll talk a bit about why you and I came together to write this op-ed piece that was in the Business Insider yesterday about the radicalization inside of the Christian communities and how many of us need to take the lead from, many of us in the Christian world need to take the lead from those of you in the Muslim community who've had to take on radicalization and all. But could you give a little background on how you started Muslims for Progressive Values and what's happening in that world and your own history with all this?
I see us, you and I, Doug, as twins, but two different sperms. same egg.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a whole new metaphor right there. That's beautiful.
So let's see. Where do I start? I basically wanted to create a progressive Muslim community that was inclusive and really going back to the roots of the Quran of love and compassion and social justice. And because after 9/11, after rereading the Quran, it was eye-opening to learn that it was actually quite a liberating text in how it was inclusive of all faiths. It's not a new religion. It's a continuation of the previous ones. It was about empowering individuals, and particularly for those who are the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised women, the slaves, the lower caste tribes, and so that it really spoke truth to power, essentially. And with that sacred text as a foundation, it was easy for me to break away from the traditional mosque, because I felt like, well, the mosque is not really practicing Islam in the truest form. It was just practicing patriarchy and a tribal interpretation of Islam, even here in the United States. And so based here in America, we have the advantage of really stripping away culture, and particular harmful cultural practices in religion, and there's a lot of that in all religions, and really go back to the purity of the faith, of the values. And so we have our 10 principles. It is very egalitarian and inclusive of all faith, on and non-faith, the right to leave Islam with no punishment, LGBT rights, women's reproductive rights, women's self-determination, basically, right? So critical thinking of sacred texts and your right to interpret that, as long as it's not harmful, it doesn't hurt your fellow human beings and the environment. So that is basically the context of what I wanted for myself as a community. And being a transplant from Malaysia to Los Angeles, I was born, raised Muslim. I really wanted to create a new community that was of like mind. And fortunately, there were a lot of Americans that also had the same, that were on the same journey. And so we journeyed on together. And what really was just me wanting a community for myself in Los Angeles ended up being a movement. And, we have organizations in Latin America that basically, took MPV's logo and just edited a little bit and then adapted, took on our values, our 10 principles, and same in Europe. And similarly, there were others in Canada that were doing something similar. And so it really became an inclusive, progressive Muslim movement, and where particularly Muslims in the West were just feeling very, they wanted to break away from that cultural, the cultural baggage that they felt was a disconnect in the values of the Quran. So that's one. But what's really interesting since then, since 2007, there's also been a lot of Muslim organizations in the Muslim world that has been coming to us, including from Yemen and several countries in Africa, and the Arab world. And so there's a lot of this shift going on in the Muslim world and sort of an enlightened movement. And so now the term inclusive Islam is being used in academia even. And the work that we've been doing in the Muslim world and at the United Nations, and how we challenge the human rights abuses in the name of Sharia law with our inclusive and what we call an Islamic human rights language, has really started resonating globally. And so that's where we're at.
Well, it's so fun and fascinating to know that Islam, like every other religion, is dynamic. It's being framed by the people who practice the faith everywhere that it's being practiced, and that there's a call inside of a sacred text that people are trying to live up to and trying to know. And look, a lot of people don't know this. They don't know it. People that are inside of Islam often don't know that, right?
Exactly.
There's a
That's
lot of work.
the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done, and people don't understand one another's faiths. And, as you and I both working inside of faith communities, we know people inside faith communities don't understand their own. So the lack of understanding of what our call forward is, that's just continuous work that goes on. And look, there are a lot of people who are saying, and I hear it all the time, and I'm sure we'll see it in the comments, on this feed, people saying, people in the Muslim community, leaders need to speak out about radicalization. They need, there's a lot of worry about how jihadist movements around the world have wreaked havoc, and how some more conservative and fundamentalist movements have taken over Islam. So you hear this all the time, right? People saying, where are the moderate Muslims? And there are many, so many, you and other groups that are trying to speak out about this. And I feel like something's happening in the United States where there's equally an expression of a radicalized version of Christianity, manifest in the Christian right and manifest in Christian nationalism, showed up at the insurrection on January 6th and stormed the Capitol. And, people, I've got up on the screen here for those watching on the live feed, the image that was taken at the insurrection where it's a flag that says Trump 2020, and then another flag that says Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, on the same flag with an American flag in there. And this kind of conflating of a religious identity and a political identity brought to a cultural front, that's the thing that people in the Muslim community have been working on and dealing with for a very long time, and for a lot of us, for the last 2 decades with a kind of urgency. So, do you want to say anything more about that before we talk a little bit about the need to write this op-ed that we did in Business Insider together? But like, how are people in the Muslim communities that you're interacting with thinking about the work of de-radicalization inside of the Muslim community these days?
Yeah, well, the thing is, the Muslims in the Muslim world are the direct victims of the radical Muslims from within us, and it's so mind-boggling for me when those non-Muslims in the West always challenge the Muslims as if we are responsible for it. And I'm like, I have nothing to do with these people. I have nothing to do with Baghdadi. I have nothing to do with the ISIS. I have nothing to do with the Taliban. I have nothing to do with, Saudi Arabia, right? I've got nothing to do with them. And so the big difference, and on top of that, the victims of these radical track of Islam, for example, are the Muslim populations themselves. And the harm the Taliban has done to its population in Afghanistan is mind-boggling. And the harm the Saudi Arabia government has done to its member of its citizen is also mind-boggling. And the same with Iran. And same of so many of these Muslim governments are themselves pretty radical in their interpretation of Islam as well. But I didn't like them, so I have nothing to do with it. And many of these Muslims in the West have nothing to do with these blokes and their policies. And so the difference, and what has happened since 9/11 is in America, for example, the sweep of anyone that looked Muslim, and that included Sikh and Indians, and that were swept into these suspicion entrapments, and also, ignorance, who killed Sikhs because they thought they were Muslims because they were wearing turbans. This just goes to show how how lacking in knowledge, or I don't even know how to describe this. How even like the discrimination against Asians right now, right? It's like, if you speak Thai, you're like, well, people don't know that that's not Chinese. I'm just saying, right? It's like, it's not that simple, people. So, so this whole us against them, black and white worldview it's not the world we live in. And the radical Muslims are no different than the radical Christian right. And we'll get to that in a second. But the Muslim, well, I wouldn't say moderate, but the Muslim tradition, conservative leadership in America even, and across the world, has written extensively against this ISIS phenomena and the radicalism. And mostly it's because it's impacting them, and impacting them from the non-Muslim world. It's not really doing it. I'm sure you and your listeners have heard until you're blue in the face, Islam is a religion of peace. Well, we don't really have a very peaceful world in the Muslim world. It's pretty chaotic, and it's pretty mayhem. It's corrupt. It's not up there in the scale, and all the world scales of human rights, all the scales of women's rights, LGBT rights, patent registrations. It's just not there. So there's something wrong inherently in the way it's being governed in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, they're using Islam as the context of how they govern. And it has nothing to do with Islam. And it's just politics, good old politics. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, I think that's a really important point. I was in a conversation with a reporter who looked at our article, and wanted to do some follow-up for a Danish newspaper. Actually, he's a Danish reporter, and he said, a lot of people in Denmark and like a lot of people in Europe, they're trying to figure out what's happening in the United States, right? And why is there this religious movement that feels so much like the radicalized versions of other religions around the world? And I have to acknowledge that, look, every religion has a radical edge to it. We know this, right? There is no.
It's happening in India. It's happened in Myanmar with the Buddhists. It's crazy. It's a crazy
right.
world.
Every human society that has religion that has a predominant religion that it can avail itself to also has an extremist edge and uses that religion as a means toward that end. And that the notion that there's a religious identity that someone has, so whether someone just says I'm Muslim or I'm a Buddhist or Hindu or I'm a Christian, and if that identity can become politicized, can become activated for their own self use, right? So they understand themselves as in that tradition, but it doesn't come with the obligation of morality and the ethical obligation of caring for one another and being peaceful and moving toward the common good for all people. If you have an identity that doesn't have the obligation, the religious teachings obligation in it, that's where the danger comes. And this is one of the things that I think has happened in the United States with the radical Christian right, is that there's many people who identify in a culture that gives a lot of extra benefit to people who identify in the Christian tradition. But there's also this whole movement that says that's just a political identity and not a moral, ethical, or even religious identity. And this is a thing that's facing us as faith leaders across all these traditions, right? And every faith leader I've ever known in every tradition always, struggles with getting the people of their communities to actually live up to their faith. So of course that's going to be a pursuit that we're always in. That's just
hang on. Let me stop there for a minute.
Please.
I think these religious leaders are hypocrites, because if your constituents are not following along and living up to the values that you so proclaim, then you are a really bad religious leader. Sorry. I know so many religious leaders just talk a good talk, but they are such BS. They don't practice what they preach, and they don't even preach right. And that's why we have the mayhem we have. And that's why we have the divisions that we have. If you really taught the real tenets of your faith, whatever your faith is about doing good, the common good, your brother's keeper, all that good stuff. And what the hell is it? So all these religious leaders, they're just BS, and they just are so politically correct, and they know what to say. I'm so up to my eyeball with these people. They sit at the United Nations and they pretend that they're all about human rights, and they use all the human rights terms, and everybody believes them. But in actuality, what they do in the field and in their community is not to lift up their community, but it's the same patriarchal and oppressive religious system. So I'm tired of it. I just call it out. Sorry.
No, I'm really glad you're so blunt about that. And to be clear, I mean, you're speaking across religious traditions where religious leaders use the teachings of their religion as sort of the backdrop, but not the call, right? It serves this cultural, political work and space that a lot of people find themselves in. And I think that's really the struggle. And this is why, in the piece that you and I collaborated on instead of Business Insider, we put this strain on religious leaders, right? The headline that they craft, because that's how it works in these things. I was really comfortable with that. Radicalized Christian nationalism is one of the biggest threats facing the U.S. Christian leaders need to root the extremism out from their communities. And I think what you're getting at is something important, that there's a two-headed approach to this kind of work, it seems to me. It has to be a people movement. Religions are always people movements, right? Every religion puts power in the hands of all of us, that you have access to the divine and to one another and to ethical goodness. But it also involves leaders, because everywhere in the world, people organize their communities and somebody gives a leadership position, leadership role. And really, you have to, in my view, you have to have both of these movements happening: people movements, grassroots efforts, and leadership that are responding and doing what leaders need to do. And I feel like in the United States, one of our major crises that we're facing right now is the idea that Christian leaders are going down a path of being overly silent, facing down radical Christian movement in the United States. And that can sound extremist. And even when I hear myself say it, I have to sort of check and make sure I'm not sort of being overly dramatic or conflating. But you look across the board at issues that have dominated our society of citizen against citizen, citizen against their government, whole movements of violence, individual shootings. Like you can look at shootings, mass shootings at synagogues and mosques, at Christian churches, in schools, in shopping malls, in theaters, and over and over and over again, the results come back that this person was part of a Christian narrative that told them that they were trying to save America, the United States of America, for some reason that was fueled by a Christian identity that saw somebody as the other that they needed to strike out against. That if that were in the United States, if that were any other religious group, that you had this trail over decades of this kind of work being organized at a systemic level within leaders, we would call that a radicalized religious movement. And that's what it is in the United States. I would love to be able to say that Christian nationalism is just a fringy misunderstanding, a fringe group that misunderstands American history and Christianity. It is a group that misunderstands Christianity and American history, but it's not fringe. It is embedded inside of our military, inside of our police, inside of our government. We just, had a government for 4 years that trafficked in this stuff, not only in their messaging, but literally in their personnel, putting people in place that were doing this. And it's a terrifying reality that what we're facing in the United States can be called a radicalized Christian right movement.
It is actually a very terrifying circumstance that we're in right now. But it is something that the Christian right has been working towards for decades, and in partnership with the Republican Party. And so they've been very strategic. They've had very long-term planning around this. This is not new. And what has happened is that the messaging has become more radicalized over the years, and obviously during the Trump years. But I think that the problem with religion too, and I'm speaking as a person of faith, the problem with religion is that the religious organizations or institutions, when they talk about values, they're always talking about how do we help ourselves up. They're not, for the most part, really interested in helping those outside their club, their religious belief system, right? And that's the problem with religion. And so obviously some faith traditions, or even within the Muslim community, there are some Muslim camps that are just so insular that they are in a bubble of their own, and they have no clue what's going outside of their own particular small community. And you have that with the Orthodox Jews, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, for example, etc. And you have that in all these different religious belief systems. And this is why America is such a faith, there are a lot of, the majority of, I think 70% or so or more of Americans believe in a faith tradition or are spiritual. And so that is the character of American citizenship compared to Denmark or Northern Europeans, for example. But that's why you're probably getting this questions like, why are you guys so religious? I mean, you are, and I've had a speaking engagement in Denmark where it was a huge forum, and the guy asked me, "Wow, Ani, you sound so rational. How is it that you're still a Muslim?"
There's a lot of that.
That's Northern Scandinavian Europeans for you, but I think the most important thing for America right now, and in reflection to the article, I think it's really important that the Well, I think the FBI and our government, the judicial system also is now woke to the idea that, hey, we actually have a radical Christian problem in America now. When they were pretty much brushing all this under the rug. I think now where there's going to be more investigation on, uprooting a lot of these, these radical rights in the military and Air Force and police, etc. So I think they are awakening to it, but it took, January 6th for that to really, for that to come to light. But in the article, there was a generalization of similarity between what happened to Muslims after 9/11 and what happened to the Christian right after the January 6th. I don't think there's really, the one example I have to defer to the generalization is that, and after 9/11, there were a lot of Muslims that were swept into prison cells where they were not allowed to make calls to their families or to attorneys, and families didn't even know they were taken up by the police and in prison, not charged, sometimes up to 2 years. Whereas with these blokes and the surgeons of January 6th, they get to ask for organic food. I'm sorry. and, right. And they were actually released without bail even. Because whatever stupid excuse the judge gives them, it's really mind-boggling, the double standard. So I just needed to point that out.
No, I'm so glad that you did. It sure is mind-boggling, because there is still, while some people are raising the issue that the white nationalists and the insurrectionists came together through the Trump administration's invitation to a lot of action over the last number of years to be much more public. And this can go all the way back to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and all the way up to the insurrection and many hundreds and hundreds of public rallies around the United States in the last 4 years that have been intentional connection points for radical groups in the United States. The FBI watches them, Homeland Security. This is all very public, paying attention to these radicalized groups. What a lot of people don't know is that at the back end of that's often funded by Christian communities, pastors, churches. They're organizing pods for this. Now, look, not every conservative Republican Christian is into Christian nationalism. In fact, one of the things we're doing with this podcast, why we put out this article, one of the things that we're going to do with the whole training that we'll be doing every Tuesday night in April through Vote Common Good with a live webinar, is to try to make a distinction between someone who's socially and politically conservative and religious and people who are radicalized Christian nationalists and other kinds of Christian nationalists. That's where the divide has to come. We cannot allow the divide simply to be, are you politically conservative or politically progressive? Because that's not where the problem lies. The problem lies in this aggressive radicalization that is going on almost exclusively in the conservative side. So what conservative leaders especially have to do is to pay a lot of attention to the radicalization that's happening there. And that's what's been going on. These a lot of conspiracy theories are a big deal for Christian pastors. They've begun to realize in the last, if not 4 years, in the last 4 months, how many people in their churches follow beliefs that come out of some of the QAnon groups, which is one of the sort of alternative facts movements in the United States. That's a coming together of many different conspiracy theories. This is a real problem for conservative churches. And it's happening under the radar to a whole lot of people who don't even know when they hear something that sounds sort of, I'm opposed to the government, that can very quickly become something that says what we need to do is replace our current secular government, to the degree that our government is secular in the United States, with a Christianized version. So when Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who I'm going to do everything I can personally to make sure he's not the senator after the election in 2022, if he chooses to run. But when he said, oh, look, when I saw who these people were that were storming the Capitol, I wasn't personally afraid. because I know that these are people who love America and are law-abiding. Now, had it been people who support Black Lives Matter or Antifa, which I don't even know what Antifa is for these folks, but Black Lives Matter, I don't think those people love America. So they were the people he said were given the pass. These are the same people that the court system looks at and says, well, you're a good upstanding person. This is the same kind of person that those police officers and Capitol Police and others looked at in the eyes and said, hey, no, I'm with you. I mean, I get it. Just kind of tone it down a little bit. This is a different kind of radicalization that we've never seen in the United States, because it's not an outsider group. It's an inside group that has all the privilege, and they're the ones that have radicalized. This is what I think makes this so particularly dangerous.
So for me, it's deja vu. Like, I've seen this before, and I've always said, and I've said this for many years, that there's no such thing as benign radical theology. People people on the political left, they're just conservative, they're just giving a pass to religious interpretations that are intolerant. That level of intolerance can shift as you become more radicalized. And that's what happens in radicalization, is that you have a very fixated position of intolerance towards the other, whoever the other is. And you start justifying it in theological terms. And you will not pick up an arm and hurt this person, but your theology and your fervor becomes even more intense and intense and intense, to the point where, you know what, I'm really pissed off now. I'm really mad at this other. I'm going to pick up a gun and then I'm going to go for it. So that line isn't a very hard line to cross, because you're already radicalized, because you already, your DNA is imbued with this hate for the other, and it's justified in a religious context. And so crossing that line into doing physical harm is not a very hard line to cross, actually.
That's right. Yeah. And this does show up in religious teaching and in theology. And that's why Christian leaders, in my view, need to be more Christian and not just more political, right? It's almost in Minnesota we have a lot of lakes, so canoeing is a really big deal. And one of the things you realize when you're paddling a canoe is that no stroke of the paddle goes back perfectly straight, right? So you don't make yourself go straight by just thinking you're going to paddle straight. What you always have to do is be sure that if you're paddling on one side, that you turn and paddle on the other, or that you use a stroke that goes out with a stroke that goes in. You have to find this balance. And when leaders are trying to ask their communities to sort of live in public spaces, they also have to check their theology, right? And when you have a theology that's calling for passion, you have to check that with a public commitment that is inclusive. Like this is why the theological project of being inclusive is not just choosing a particular reading of your scriptural text. It's actually a public service, right? Helping someone understand their own faith, their notion of God and spirituality and demand. Because if you tell someone that God hates, what human beings want to do is, if they're religious, especially in the Abrahamic traditions, they want to be like God, right? That's kind of the thing you want to do, right? You sort of want to match yourself with the ethic of God. So when you have a God who can hate, that line, as you're saying, to step over into hating a person, it starts to bend you toward that hate is okay. And then in the Christian tradition, if you take a violent act like the execution of Jesus and try to justify that with some theological narrative, now hatred, God's will, ending someone's life, these all become options that in the right circumstance can be considered. This leads to war, this leads to violence, this leads to all kinds of justification.
So these people, so we are people of faith, try to be more godly in our behavior. Okay. However, A lot of Muslims, they usurp the role of God as the judge, and therefore they judge you that you're not Muslim enough, you are out of line, you are whatever, and so your blood is halal, meaning permissible to be killed. So that's happened to me, and the problem is that all these people that take on the judicial role of God is the problem. And when, that in itself is blasphemous.
Mhm.
But what I think that we should really be, religious leaders should be really speaking about, is the loving and compassionate God, and not this angry and violent God, because that's also in our sacred texts as well. So I think that what the religious teachings has to shift towards one that is the loving and compassionate God, and that to do good is not to do good for what is best for our political and religious club, but also for the rest of humanity. In this particular case, your neighbor, or who's not a Christian or who's not a Muslim, what have you. So I think this is a huge a religious and cultural shift that needs to happen within all the conservative religious institutions, because there is such a level of intolerance of the other, and to varying degrees, and that's really what's destroying the fabric of America. Because we have religious freedom, that means you have the right to practice your religion, but unfortunately what's being used is the Religious Freedom Reformation Act, where conservative religious institutions are using it to justify discrimination in the name of religion. And so we're seeing what I'm starting to see now is actually conservative Muslim mosques, which most of them are, 99% are, and the conservative evangelical institutions are actually starting to team up on, or gang up on, women's reproductive rights and on LGBT rights. And so I see this is going to be a huge problem for the basic rights of women and LGBT, for example. And because that affects, that religious narrative really shapes culture, right?
That's right. And
So
this alignment of cultural conservatives, religious cultural conservatives within the Muslim community and the Christian community, it's a new formation right there. It's like in the last 20 years, there was a lot of movement among conservative Christians to be anti-Muslim, and that still exists. There's no doubt about it. I can see people on our streams here already writing that kind of stuff, right? They come from a tradition that's all about Jesus, so that makes them feel like they're anti-Muslim. That exists. But this other thing that you're describing also exists, right? Which is people are now starting to organize their conservative Muslim groups with their conservative Christian groups around certain causes and around certain issues. And I think it'd be helpful if you told people what we talked about after the election, when we were both sort of scouring the results of polling about how people from different religious traditions voted. And there's a lot of surprising numbers in there. And one of those that I was surprised by was the number of Muslims who voted for Donald Trump, and the reasons why they said they did. Because to a lot of people, they thought the Trump administration is the most anti-Muslim administration you could have, from the way he spoke about them, from the threats that he issued to them, to travel bans and referring to the countries they come from. Like, all of that seems so anti-Muslim. But then something happened after and then something happened after the.
And yeah, it's mind-boggling that more Muslims voted for Trump the second time around than the first time around. And I think the first time was like about 16, and the second time I think it was like 30. And the reason, and there was this one imam that I speak to, and he's traditional, and he interviewed and asked these guys, why did you vote for Trump? And as well, we don't we don't support the Black Lives Matter, and we don't care for we're afraid of the LGBT agenda. I'm like, what is the agenda? They just want basic human rights, people. I'm like, seriously? Don't you have those rights? Oh, it's so
Yeah, it is shocking when
maddening.
we learned that the percentage of Muslims who voted for Trump in 2016, 16%, something like that, and then goes up to nearly 30% in 2020. And the reason is that inside of Muslim communities, movements fearing Black Lives Matter and fearing inclusion of LGBTQ communities in our government and through our government was the primary reason that they voted for the Trump agenda and for Donald Trump. That is the same movement that's happening inside of evangelical Christianity. I promise you, it is. As somebody who was out on the road and doing work and calling Christians to faith, hope, and love for a change on Election Day, nothing fired up that anti-progressive movement like putting a Black Lives Matter sign out in front of our rallies. It literally had people stealing our signs, threatening us, and lining up hundreds of people in opposition to what we were doing, because that movement to them represents something that was conspiratorial and inaccurate, and also they understood exactly what it was about, saying that Black Lives Matter needs to be a focus of people in the United States because we're living in a way that it doesn't. And so for people to think that, well, you're telling me that Muslim communities were resisting Black Lives Matter? Like, you could sort of understand why your caricature of like white evangelicals don't want that. As it turns out, many white evangelicals support Black Lives Matter, but this radicalized fringe does not. Yeah. That would happen inside of Islam and inside of Muslim communities was really shocking to me. And as I've told it to anybody else, they have been equally, like their eyes get wide, their head shakes, and they just think, I don't know what's happening with religion in America.
No,
Why
exactly.
is it being radicalized so aggressively?
Exactly. And that's why the youth have, given up on religion, right? It's like, why should I follow a religion that hates on others? And so there's been, the Muslim community in America, outside of the African American Muslim community, there are mostly immigrants from the various parts of the world. And there is a really systemic racism problem within the Muslim community of brown Muslim communities. And so, and they are very powerful. And I mean, there is this cultural thing where, they use derogatory terms to describe slaves towards a Black person in America, so it's a real deep-rooted issue. It's not so with the younger generation, but that's the kind of, that's the kind of inclusivity and pushback that we as Muslims for Progressive Values have always been speaking of, like the inclusivity, the spiritual equality of all human beings, regardless of ethnicity, race, religion, and sexuality. It's there's let me get a little religious here on you.
Please do.
So in the womb, so at some point around 40 days, this is the point when the cells have done its scientific part and continues to do its scientific part. There's a spiritual part that happens. And that is when, in the Quran, it says, when God blows its breath into the womb to give the spirit into the fetus, that it becomes human. And so just take that verse in itself. It just debunks all this classism and all this racial and all the sexual delineation of who's better than who and what and whatever. We're all equal in this regard, just based on that one verse. And I think, and it's worth repeating this every time. And I keep repeating this every time now, the more I reflect on this verse, because it really brings down everyone to the same level. There's no hierarchy in who we are as human beings. And this includes the animal world too, right? So they are part of this universe that we have been, as human beings, that we have been tasked with being caretakers of, which we are horribly doing a horrible job, by the way. So back to
Yeah,
you.
and this idea that we're going to find a way, and that we need to find a way to live well with one another. That is the project of the religious texts, right? Especially the Jewish text, the Christian text, and the Muslim text. And the communities that have been forming around those faiths have embedded in them, literally from the founding narratives, right? Like, it's the question is not always, and I don't know my Islamic teachings as well as the Jewish and Christian
Yeah,
ones.
Doug, what happened to you?
I don't know. I've been busy. I don't know. I don't pay attention to the important things in my life.
I'm messing with you.
I'm easily distracted. But the question is not like, are we part of the same family, right? If you use the text from the Jewish and Christian traditions that they like to focus on for this, with a particular reading of the book of Genesis, and maybe the reading would be the same in the Islamic reading, that it's Cain and Abel, who are brothers, whose dad in the story is the son of God. They're the sons of the son of God, brothers, and one brother kills the other brother. The question is not, are we connected? The question is, how will we live out our obligation to one another? Where this "am I my brother's keeper" comes from. And Jacob and his brothers, and Joseph and his brothers, and all the brothers, and then the sisters. And so this big call, and in the Christian tradition, you push for Jesus saying, well, let's live in a different way where we can be in the family of God that has an obligation, and not in the family of Jews and Gentiles and the rest. But that brings this ethical question, right, of how will we live with one another? And that's the pervading question that exists through traditions, through religions, and over time. That's what we're faced with, and that's what's happening now, right? So, the beauty of a religious tradition, and one of the reasons that I continue to want to utilize the benefits and the beauty of the Christian tradition for my own call, is that it connects you with some stories of people who've been trying to work this out. In some ways that it does not work at all, and some ways in which it calls you to the possibility that you can find a one another with one another, right? You can be a one another and care for one another. And this one anotherism is what all the religious teaching sort of pushes toward, which is what makes the radicalization inside of any religion so counter to it, right? And I know for some people, they really hear it the other way, because they kind of believe that people who get radicalized are deeper believers, especially if someone's outside of the religious tradition. You know what I mean? They
moronic. It's like,
well,
no,
that's where it would
actually
go. Yeah. Go on.
No, it's so moronic. I mean, just so therefore, this is what I've noticed, even in my family, is that the more quote unquote religious they become, the more hateful and more radicalized they are. I'm like, what is this? This is just the counter of the antithesis of Islam, or any religion for that matter. And that is, this is what we need to do, is to debunk this notion that, no, just because you pray 5 times and you have you dress it, you speak it, it does not make you more religious, because it's not about that. It's about doing good, like the common good theme, mantra, philosophy of what you have, Doug. That's what this is all about. And I think we really need to push harder against those that define themselves as religious and that are the voice and representative of a religion. We need to really debunk and dethrone them, because they are the ones. You cannot really be representative of any faith traditions if your philosophy of religion is to discriminate against others. It's just unacceptable. And I think that if we come together in that sort of a common good narrative, it will bring more people to the cause of doing good for others, regardless of what religion you are, right? I think religions are all struggling with this, and then in the interfaith religious fora, I find it. I'm not very much into this interfaith stuff anymore, like I used to, um, because I find that a lot of the times it's these institutions, religious institutions that come together that sing kumbaya, walk together. And even though that is actually very important to show solidarity among interfaith entities, but I find that it's a bit of a shallow varsity to it, and it just really doesn't go deep in the work of the interfaith work that really needs to happen. And if the interfaith alliance that's happening in America now are between two conservative institutions like the Christian evangelical conservative branch and Muslim mosques, well, that's not the kind of interfaith relationships that we should be.
Interesting. Yeah.
We should be really worried. We're really, really worried about that coalition, I think.
I do too. Yeah, it's unnerving, and this notion that people believe that if you become more religious, you're going to become more conservative is really common, right? Like when people hear about the work that we do, or they hear the work that you do, I'm sure you get these same kind of responses where people will say, yeah, but you're probably having to walk away from some of the teachings of your faith in order to be more progressive, more inclusive, right? They think it's like the diet version or the light version, the sugar-free or fat-free version of the religion, right? It's sort of it's been modified in some way so that you can be progressive, so that you can be inclusive, so that love can be your driving ethos. The number of people who believe that to be more progressive, inclusive, and kind and one anotherism and what one another focused requires that you become less committed to the teachings of your faith. That's a quandary a lot of people feel. I mean, I watch people leave the Christian tradition all the time. I have lots of friends who've been professionals in this work, like they've done it they're pastors, and they'll even sometimes feel like, well, in order just not to be so exclusivist, I had to leave Christianity. I get it. Everyone has to find their path. But it seems to me that, I don't know, if you're going to follow the teachings of Jesus, who's going to teach you, in the Christian tradition, that you're going to follow, if you want to know that you're truly a follower, it's proved out by loving one another. And that, that scripture in the book of James says that true religion that God accepts is that you care for orphans and widows in their distress, and you keep yourself from being polluted by the divisions of this world, right? Like you don't play in that game, and you care for the other. Like why those why people still so profoundly believe that if you get all soft and inclusive and love-filled, somehow you've left the narratives of your teaching. I think it's one of the great problems that we face, right, is that then it seeds religion and it seeds the faiths over to conservatives and to people who can radicalize it, to do all kinds of things with it that we know have a history of being dangerous. Is that similar inside of Islam?
Yeah, totally. It's just the orthodoxy is very intolerant so the word orthodoxy too, we can play around. I mean, it's just so complicated because after all, we're creating our own progressive orthodoxy in our own progressive movement, right? Like our inclusivity is a new orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Or can you say then our new form of inclusive Islam is a revisit of old orthodoxy at the root of Quran, right? So but the thing is, I find myself catching myself even using the term orthodoxy to define the conservative branch of Islam, when actually, well, that is a orthodoxy. It's not the orthodoxy, right? You have a truth. You don't have the truth, right? And so on and so forth. So I think we just, even within our progressive and inclusive movements, we have to be more assertive And I think, because we've been told that, oh, you're like you say, you're Christian light or you're Muslim light. But I think that if anything, we have to be more assertive in how we frame our theology and how we frame our position, and how what we are doing is actually at the heart of Islam. And because for MPV, when I started this in 2007, one of the first few things I did in the first few years is actually establish the theological foundation for our positions and for our principles. And because of that, obviously a lot of people attacked us. Oh, you're not really Muslims. But when they read through the position statements and they read through the theology of it, the Muslims who try to undermine us, they recognize, well, you know what, they're using the Quran. I can't argue against that. And that's why you will not find a traditional imam in America sit with me on a stage to have a debate about Islam in front of a diverse audience, because I can talk theology and I can talk about inclusive Islam and human rights Islam based on the Quran and the examples of Prophet Muhammad. And so when the mosque says, oh yeah, of course, Islam, has always been a champion of women's rights. Well, where is it in your mosque, people? It's easy to call it out. And for them, it's an embarrassment. And they always say, well, it's the culture. So, well, you've been in America for 50 years. What happened? You're still perpetuating the same patriarchal tribal interpretation of Islam. Just do away with it, and you would actually get more Muslims coming to your mosque, because only 27% of American Muslims attend the mosque. The rest don't. And so, like 70% of American Muslim women find spiritual inspiration outside the mosque. 69% of American Muslim men do the same thing. This is based on pure research. So for the mosque the mosque need to get woke, and they need to realize that they need to just go back to the roots of the Quran of egalitarianism, and they will be overflowing. There will be not enough mosques, because so many of the American Muslims who have left the mosque will go back to the mosque.
It is so intriguing how, for those of us in the Christian tradition, to see those similarities, right? That it's religiously driven, that there's aspirations that are sort of function like the unfunded mandate of, that Bush used to talk about in the early 2000s for education, right? That there are these mandates that didn't have any funding. There's this call for equality and peace and life, but it doesn't get a play inside of our actual structures. And it could be that we're just religious leaders that, want our tradition to be better, and it could just be an insider conversation, like every industry wants its own industry to sort of live up to its morals. But on the other hand, this stuff becomes public, and it becomes a public health hazard. And religious radicalization, and what I think we saw with the Christian rights, Christian Nationalism's move from 2016 through January 16th or January 6th, 2021, that move showed us that this really does have public health and public sustainability issues to it. And I think we're in a moment with religion in America that needs where this needs to be addressed. And I need to be in this friendship and partnership and conversation. And again, I'll point people that we did an article in Business Insider. If you want to share something like that around, you can find it. There's a link in this feed here, whether you're listening on the podcast or on the live stream of it. And you can also Google it and find it in Business Insider if that's something you're looking for. It's just really important work, Ani. So thank you for Muslims for Progressive Values, which is at muslimsforprogressivevalues.org. And anything else you want to say about the work that you're up to and things that you have going on in the next in the foreseeable future here?
Oh, I just finished co-authoring an inclusive Islam curriculum for children rooted in human rights. And so it's the first of its kind. And I co-authored this with Shalina Tareen, who's an early child development expert. And so I'm actually really excited about this curriculum. And it'll be published probably in the next few weeks. It's an online curriculum.
That's incredible. So important.
Yes.
Thank you for that work. And for all of you that follow us here on the podcast only, look us up sometime if you've got a computer or phone in front of you and you want to see what's going on. You can find it over on Facebook or at votecommongood.com. And if you're somebody that just watches on the live stream and you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, we love it when you do. And leave us a comment in all of those places because it really does mean a lot to us. You can find it at votecommongood.com/podcast. Also, sign up for our email, would you? Because we send out a lot of stuff that we think is helpful. And when you head over to the Muslims for Progressive Values site, they also have a newsletter sign-up button right there on the front. And click on it because you want more good in your email box, don't you? You want a little common good and a little bit of good news coming in your email box every now and again. So Ani, thank you for being a part of this today, and all of you, if you're still around. Hey, we're going to be talking economics tomorrow. We have our Vote Common Good economist on, so we're going to be talking about all things to do with both what's happening with the relief bills, what's happening with like how much money can the government actually spend? Should we spend $3 trillion more on infrastructure? We think so, and we think it would actually be great. So if you're into those conversations, we do science and economics on Friday. We do news on Mondays. We talk politics directly on Tuesdays, and we have Christian faith leaders on Wednesdays, and then topics like this on Thursday. So, Ani, thanks again, and to all of you who stick with us all the time, we will talk to you and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Doug. Bye, everyone.